Of the 12,000 tail gunners who flew in B-17 flying fortresses over Europe, more than 8,000 never made it past their fifth mission. They had the highest casualty rate of any aircrew position in the entire war, facing a 67% chance of being killed, severely wounded, or captured before they could even prove themselves in combat. But the tail gunner position was also described as the most critical defensive position on the entire bomber. The fortress simply couldn't survive without them. Yet their story reveals a brutal calculus of war that nobody talks about. And now you're going to see why. When people discuss the air war over Europe, they usually focus on the pilots, the bombardiers, or the famous bombing raids themselves. But the tail gunner occupied what became known as the loneliest and deadliest position in the entire aircraft. The B-17 flying fortress was designed to fly in tight formations during daylight raids deep into German territory. The theory was simple. Massed defensive firepower from multiple bombers flying together would create an impenetrable wall of lead that enemy fighters couldn't penetrate. But theory and reality were two very different things. The tail gunner sat in complete isolation at the very back of the aircraft, squeezed into a cramped compartment barely large enough for one man. He was separated from the rest of the crew by the entire length of the fuselage. No one could reach him during combat. No one could help him if something went wrong. And something went wrong constantly. The position itself was strategically vital. German fighter pilots knew that the tail gun represented the fortress's primary rear defense. If they could knock it out, they could attack the formation from behind with near impunity. The entire defensive strategy of the B-17 relied on overlapping fields of fire, and the tail position was the critical anchor of that system. Lose the tail gunner, and you created a blind spot that enemy fighters would exploit mercilessly. But the Luftwaffe understood this better than anyone. By 1943, German fighter tactics had evolved specifically to neutralize tail gunners as quickly as possible. They studied American formations, analyzed combat footage, and developed attack patterns designed around one simple principle: kill the tail gunner first, then massacre the formation from behind. The most effective tactic was called the stern attack, and it was exactly what it sounds like. German fighters would position themselves directly behind and slightly below the bomber formation, right in the tail gunner's firing cone. Then they would accelerate to attack speed, closing the distance at a combined velocity of over 500 miles per hour. The tail gunner would have mere seconds to acquire the target, calculate the lead, and fire accurately while both aircraft screamed toward each other. And here's the critical part. The German pilot only needed one good burst. The tail gunner needed to hit a fast-moving fighter coming straight at him while sitting in an aircraft that was bouncing, weaving, and being thrown around by flak and turbulence. The attacking pilot had another advantage. He was shooting at a stationary position. The tail gunner couldn't move, couldn't dodge, and was silhouetted perfectly against the sky. German pilots learned to aim for the tail section specifically. One burst of 20mm cannon fire through that thin aluminum skin, and the tail gunner was done. The Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt 109 both carried enough firepower to shred the tail section in a single pass, and they did it again and again. The armor situation made everything worse. Early B-17 models had almost no armor protection for the tail position. There was a small armored plate behind the gunner's seat, maybe a quarter-inch of steel. That was it. Everything else was thin aluminum that 7.92mm machine gun rounds could punch through like paper, and 20mm cannon shells would obliterate completely. Even when later models added more armor plating, it was never enough. The weight restrictions meant that truly effective armor would make the aircraft too heavy to fly with a full bomb load. So the tail gunners kept flying in what was essentially a metal coffin with windows. But it wasn't just enemy fire that killed tail gunners. The position itself was a death trap in multiple ways. At 25,000 feet, temperatures dropped to 40 or 50 degrees below zero. The tail section had no heating system. None. The gunner sat back there for 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours at a time in temperatures that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. They wore electrically heated suits, but those failed constantly. When the heating element stopped working, which they did frequently, the gunner had to choose between frostbite or abandoning his position. Many chose to stay. They lost fingers, toes, and ears to frostbite. Some froze to death at their guns and weren't discovered until the plane landed. The oxygen system was equally unreliable. The tail gunner's oxygen line ran the entire length of the aircraft. That meant more connections, more potential failure points, and more opportunities for the line to be severed by flak or enemy fire. If the line was cut, the gunner had maybe 30 seconds before he passed out from hypoxia. And once unconscious at that altitude, he was dead. The rest of the crew wouldn't even know until someone tried to contact him on the intercom and got no response. By then, it was usually too late. Then there was the matter of actually firing the guns. The twin .50 caliber machine guns in the tail position were powerful weapons, but they were also violent, temperamental machines that malfunctioned constantly in the extreme cold. The guns would jam, freeze, or misfire. Spent shell casings would pile up in the cramped compartment, making movement nearly impossible. The gunner would be kneeling in a pile of hot brass, trying to clear a jam with frozen fingers while enemy fighters pressed their attack. And every time he fired, the recoil would slam his entire body backward against the cramped confines of the position. There's a documented case from a mission over Schweinfurt, where a tail gunner named Thompson had both guns jam simultaneously as 3 FW-190s lined up for a stern attack. He spent 45 seconds frantically trying to clear the jams by hand in 50 below temperatures while the fighters closed in. He got one gun working just as the first fighter opened fire. The German's burst missed him by inches, punching holes through both sides of the tail section. Thompson fired back, hit nothing, and then watched helplessly as his working gun jammed again. The second fighter's burst didn't miss. Thompson took 3 20mm cannon shells through his left side and shoulder. Somehow, he survived the mission. He never flew again. The statistical breakdown tells the real story. First mission, 18% casualty rate for tail gunners specifically, compared to 9% for the crew overall. Second mission, 21%. Third mission, 24%. By the fifth mission, the cumulative casualty rate for tail gunners reached 67%. That meant 2 out of every 3 men who climbed into that position for the first time never made it to their 6th mission. They were either dead, too wounded to fly, or prisoners in a German POW camp. The numbers varied by theater and target. Missions over the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland, were particularly deadly. The combination of heavy flak and concentrated fighter opposition pushed tail gunner casualties above 70% for the first 5 missions. Deep penetration raids to places like Berlin or Schweinfurt were worse. Some missions saw tail gunner casualties approach 40% in a single day. That's 4 out of every 10 tail gunners on that specific mission killed or wounded before they made it home. The most dangerous time frame was late 1943 through early 1944, before the introduction of long-range fighter escorts. During those months, B-17 formations flew deep into Germany without any friendly fighter cover for large portions of the mission. The Luftwaffe knew exactly when the American escorts had to turn back due to fuel limitations. They would wait, then swarm the formations with everything they had. Tail gunners during this period had the highest casualty rates of the entire war. Some bomber groups lost more than half their tail gunners in a single month. Even among those who survived, the psychological cost was devastating. Many tail gunners who completed their tours reported severe trauma from the isolation and helplessness of the position. They would sit back there alone, watching friends and other bombers die, seeing aircraft explode or spiral down in flames, all while being unable to do anything except fight off their own attackers. The intercom would crackle with the screams of wounded crewmen or the final transmissions from bombers going down. And there was nothing they could do but keep fighting from that tiny isolated compartment, waiting for the burst of cannon fire that would come for them next. The ones who survived developed certain habits. They never sat still, constantly scanning every inch of sky. They learned to recognize the glint of sunlight on canopy glass before they could see the fighter itself. They memorized the silhouettes and performance characteristics of every German fighter type. They learned to fire in short, disciplined bursts to prevent jams and conserve ammunition. And most importantly, they learned to control their fear long enough to do the job. But even with experience, even with skill, the math was brutal. The tail gunner position was designed to fail. Not because of poor engineering or bad planning, but because the fundamental tactical situation was impossible. One man, alone, in a fixed position, trying to defend against multiple attackers who could choose the time, angle, and method of their attack. The Germans just had to get lucky once. The tail gunner had to be perfect every single time. By 1944, the introduction of P-51 Mustang escorts changed everything. The long-range fighters could accompany the bombers all the way to the target and back, engaging German fighters before they could press home their attacks. Tail gunner casualties dropped dramatically. But for the men who flew those missions in 1943, before the escorts arrived, the statistics were merciless. Of the 8,000 tail gunners who died or were captured in their first 5 missions, most were between 19 and 23 years old. They climbed into that isolated position knowing the statistics, knowing what happened to most of the men who sat there before them. They did it anyway because someone had to. The fortress couldn't fly without them. The mission couldn't succeed without them. So they climbed into that metal coffin, picked up those frozen guns, and stared out at the empty sky behind the formation, waiting for the fighters they knew would come. If you want to hear more stories like this, help us out by subscribing.